This is the study session on economics and the reading on monetary and fiscal policy. Lots of LOSs in this reading. Let's try to do about one per page, one per slide. Let's start with comparing monetary and fiscal policy. Remember that central bankers control the monetary policy. Remember that federal government lawmakers control fiscal policy. Monetary policy is all about the money supply, and so the central banker can impact the availability of money, can impact the price of money, can impact the price of credit. And central bankers do this one of three ways. They can determine interest rates, they can use the open market, and they can set reserve requirements. Fiscal policy, on the other hand, is controlled by the lawmakers. And federal governments tend to do two things. They tend to tax and they tend to spend. And if those two things are equal, in other words, if the spending is equal to the tax revenues generated by the federal government, that's called a balanced budget. But most of the time, federal governments operate with a deficit, meaning that they spend more than they raise in tax revenue. And so fiscal policy, while explicitly determined by government spending and taxation, has a lot to do with managing the deficit over time. And so both of these tools are used to promote economic stability and economic growth. How about functions of money? Three ways and three observations and three methods and three purposes for money. It's a store of value, it's a unit of account, and it's a medium of exchange. And so first of all, as a store of value, we can hold on to some money today and use it to buy something tomorrow or next week or next year. Store of value. Of course, it's non-perishable. Unit of account, used for price quotations and the recording of debt. So when we borrow money to buy a car, we know exactly how much we owe the banker. Of course, it's some kind of a measure, a yardstick, to determine the value of economic transactions. And then finally, it's a medium of exchange. And so we use it to buy goods and services. Of course, in the old days, you needed cash, but nowadays, boy, does anybody carry much cash around? How about the money creation process? This is done primarily through lending. And so let's take a look at the little table that I have on the right. And let's, for now, just forget about banks B, C, and D. Just focus on Bank A. Suppose we go down to the bank and we deposit 50 euros, which means the bank has 50 euros in cash. Now, that's a liability to the bank because they owe us that 50 euros. The question then becomes, what does the banker do with our 50 euros? Well, they could keep it in cash, but then how is the bank going to make any kind of revenue and therefore profit? And so what happens is that they lend it out. Now, commercial banks are typically not allowed to lend out the entire 50 euros because there have to be some kind of a safety margin. That's called fractional reserve lending. So if the reserve requirement is 20%, the bank will be required to keep 10 euros on cash in the bank just in case I or somebody else decides to go down there and make a withdrawal. But they can lend that 40 euros out to other people. And so those 40 euros then are created and it's cast in to the money supply because the individual who borrowed the money now has 40 euros that he or she did not have. And that individual can buy a car, they can make an investment, or they could go buy a loaf of bread. I mean, whatever it is. And so this happens over and over and over again. And then I just have some examples in that table on the right about 20% and how that money supply can move through the economy. That loan then can be deposited into another bank. There's the Bank B, $40, and then Bank B has to keep 20%, and so on. And it works its way all the way down. Bank A, initial loan, then compounds into subsequent loans by other banks. How about theories on the demand for and the supply of money? This quantity of money theory has a hypothesis that suggests changes in prices correspond to changes in the money supply. And this makes perfect sense. The formula is M times V equals P times Q, where M is the quantity of money, V is velocity. And so that velocity, let me go back here to my previous slide, that velocity is a measure of how quickly that $50 in deposits in the initial deposit, 50 euros in initial deposit, moves through the banking system. So you can see where that term velocity is appropriate. It's not moving slowly, it's moving quickly. And then P times Y, the price level and real output. So think about this, the money supply times that velocity is going to have an impact on consumer prices and producer prices. We talked about that in a previous reading. And then real output. And the three primary drivers are transaction motives and precautionary motives and speculative motives. How about the Fisher effect? This is named after this dude, Irvin Fisher, who was a really famous economist who happened to lose all of his wealth in the stock market crash of 1929. But what Fisher did was establish a formal relationship between just regular old interest rates. We call those nominal rates. Think of those as borrowing rates for a home or a car. And that those things are a function of two variables. The first variable is the rate of expected inflation. And then the second part is the real rate of interest. And that real rate of interest reflects the real increase in purchasing power when an individual saves. For example, if you have $1 today and you invest it at 10%, you're going to have $1.10 sometime in the future. And if $1 today can buy you a loaf of bread, and $1 in the future will not be able to buy you a loaf of bread, if the price of a loaf of bread goes up to, let's say, $1.15, well, then your real return is negative because that dollar turns into $1.10, and a year from now you can't even buy that same loaf of bread. So the real rate reflects the real change in purchasing power. And in its simplest form, we can do just a simple addition. The nominal rate is equal to the real rate plus the expected inflation rate, but the actual reality of the relationship is the compounding. There's that 1 plus the interest rate. So 1 plus the nominal rate is equal to 1 plus the real rate times 1 plus the expected inflation rate. But the LOS just asks you to describe, so you don't have to worry about compounding. Just remember that nominal has two functions. It has two components, the real and the expected inflation rate. How about roles and objectives of central banks? Currency regulation. Of course, the central bank is the only entity that is allowed to issue currency. Control of commercial banks, central banks, what they do is they regulate, they oversee, they establish a whole set of rules about how commercial banks can operate. They're bankers and fiscal agents and advisors to the federal government. Of course, they receive deposits and make payments on behalf of the federal government. They control the credit, so that's the use of monetary policy. It's a custodian, so they hold reserves. And they also operate as the lender of last resort. And this is really fascinating. It's a fascinating scenario because commercial banks, they only go to the Fed. In the United States, they only go to the Fed when none of their other friends in the commercial banking industry will lend them money. That's why it's the lender of last resort, meaning that there's nobody out there willing to lend a commercial bank any money. And this is just for overnight reserve requirements. And so the overriding objective of central banks is to promote financial stability. How about the difference between expected and unexpected inflation? So I want you to think of it this way. Expected inflation is the expectations for the rate of price changes that everybody agrees on. And so naturally, if we buy a loaf of bread today for $1, we probably think that it's going to go up in price over time just because the natural business cycles, we talked about that in a previous reading, because of the natural business cycles, there's going to be some inflation because people like to eat bread, and if they have more money during an expansion, they're probably going to make more sandwiches, right? Unexpected inflation, on the other hand, are the result of events that occur that were not anticipated. Now, what are the costs of these kinds of things? If we expect inflation, then that's going to dictate our behavior. For example, if we think there's going to be higher inflation than in the previous year, well, that might change our behavior. There are these opportunity costs. Some people call them shoe leather costs because we have to drive to the bank more frequently to get cash if we're expecting prices to rise in the future. Now, of course, this is an old-time cost because, who really goes to the bank anymore? Clearly, being able to shop on Amazon reduces our need for cash. And so there are fewer cash transactions because of the internet. But with unexpected inflation, what's going to happen is that when consumers or businessmen and women go down to the bank to borrow money, if there's uncertainty about future inflation, then lenders are going to require higher interest rates to compensate them for that higher uncertainty. Clearly, there's going to be a reduction in the information that investors, both institutional and individuals, can infer from market prices. And then there are all other sorts of costs of unexpected inflation. Boy, if you have somebody who knows more about the rate of inflation than someone with whom they're trading, that information asymmetry and inequality, that's going to create, maybe an unfair trade, maybe an imbalance in trade, and probably some extra risk premiums. All right, how about the three tools that I talked about just a few moments ago? Interest rate policy, open market operations, and reserve requirements. And so what the central bankers do is they get to set the rate at which banks can lend money, to each other. Probably not setting the rate that banks can lend to anybody else, but when they set that low rate, when they set that federal funds rate here in the United States, then all the other rates are based on that individual federal funds rate. And of course they do it through the discount rate, which then will determine federal funds rates. They can also, the central banks can also use open market operations. Those of you who've been paying attention to what's happened in the United States over the last 10 years will know that central bankers have, the Fed has gone into the Treasury market. They bought up tons and tons of Treasury bonds. They've also gone out and bought up tons and tons of mortgage-backed securities and other long-term securities. And what does that do? When the federal government is out there buying these bonds, what happens? They bid up the price of the bond, and then the yield goes down. And so through open market operations, whenever they buy bonds, they are increasing the price of those bonds and keeping interest rates low. If interest rates are low, then what happens? This is going to add to the money supply. And then finally, through reserve requirements, remember our previous example where we had a 20% reserve requirement. Well, if banks wanted to increase the velocity of money, what they could do is make that 0%. If they wanted to reduce the velocity of money, they could make it 100%. There would be no velocity then. How about the monetary transmission mechanism? So how do monetary policy decisions impact economic growth and asset prices? And so we have a couple of things that are interesting here. Traditional interest rate channels. So what happens when the central bank lowers interest rates, however it does it? What it's going to do is lead to more borrowing and more invested. Think of this on the business side as lowering the weighted average cost of capital. And so what that does is that increases the net present value of all these projects that are out there, and then it leads to more borrowing. The balance sheet channel, when the Fed eases monetary policy, what tends to happen is when interest rates fall, that tends, doesn't always happen, but it tends to increase stock and other asset prices. Of course, bonds are included in that. Think back to the reading on equity securities and the dividend discount model. If required returns go down, stock prices go up. So there's a model that will suggest that when interest rates fall, then that results in higher equity prices. And so that leads to increased investment on the business side. Think about the right-hand side of the balance sheet. If the equity portion of a business, of a corporation, is swelling, well, then that leads to more investment. And what they're going to be able to do is find positive net present value projects. How about household liquidity? Of course, whenever a household experiences an increase in wealth, they naturally are going to buy more cars and buy more refrigerators and buy more PlayStation 4 consoles. And my children will buy more PlayStation games. And then the bank lending channel, this, what happens here is if there's lower interest rates and there's all this other stuff that we're talking about, there's going to end up with more deposits, and that's going to lead to more lending activity, more deposits. So think of the bank's balance sheet there. How about a wealth effect? This is really interesting because what's happening is that monetary policy has a tremendous possibility to influence financial wealth and consumer spending, and particularly consumer spending on things like, food and toothbrushes and all those non-durable goods and services. What it likely will impact is a change in real interest rates. Remember, we talked about that with Irving Fisher, and exchange rates and their impact on net exports. How about qualities of effective central banks? Boy, these should make perfect sense. Transparency, independence, and credibility. Those of you who are following along here in the United States, there's been some big discussion in the last several years, maybe in the last 10 or 15 years. Is the Fed truly an independent, political influence-free entity? And some people say yes, of course it is, but some people say, well, we're not quite sure exactly about the timing of some of these interest rate decisions. But clearly, transparency simply means that we know exactly what they're doing. They tell us what they're doing, and then when we trust them, but then we verify them, and when we verify, we find out that, of course, the government did exactly what they said. That's transparency. And then credibility plays a big role in here, because when the central bank says, hey, look, it's really important for us to do something, and so that do something might result in an increase in interest rates, and then we might want to see the results of that policy change, and we'll say, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. All right, how about the relationship between monetary policy and all these things? Economic growth, inflation, interest, and exchange rates. So monetary policy, remember this is by the Fed, and so what Fed's actions can influence economic growth. And so an expansionary monetary policy, by lowering interest rates, what that's going to do is probably increase economic growth. Inflation here. Now, this is a little bit tricky, because remember, in that business cycle, we want economic growth, but if the economic growth ever gets overheated, you hear that term a lot when economists talk about expansionary times, you have to concern yourself with inflation. So is the economy growing too fast? Is inflation going to get ahead of this growing economy, which means that the central bank is going to have to come in and, douse the fire, so to speak. Of course, monetary policy is going to affect interest rates. We talked about that in a previous slide with both the determination of the interest rate and the open market operations. And then we don't operate on an island. If our interest rates are getting high, then that might attract capital from other countries. And so other countries that have low interest rates might be looking at our interest rate and saying, hey, we want to convert our currency into the US dollar so we can take advantage of those higher interest rates. And so this is going to have an impact on exchange rates. Determine whether monetary policy is expansionary or contractionary. I've hinted at this throughout the slide deck so far. So an expansionary policy, this is designed to increase the supply of money and lending activity. And so how does the central banker do this? By buying securities in the open market. I talked about the treasury securities and the mortgage-backed securities. They can reduce the discount rate, which is going to influence the federal funds rate, which will influence all the other nominal rates that are out there, and then decrease the reserve requirements. And for contractionary policy, just the opposite. All right, lots of people look to the federal government and say, okay, the federal government, you people are really smart, so when the economy moves away from equilibrium points, you need to move it back. So there's a lot of confidence in the federal government to be able to influence and perhaps even control economic growth. You hear this from politicians all the time. We want to create jobs, we want to manage economic growth, we want to do all sorts of stuff. But it's not perfect. This is not a scientist working at it. This is not like, adding 1 + 1 and getting 2. This is not an engineer building a bridge. And so there are limitations and consequences to monetary policy. And so sometimes the results can be deflation. There can be decreases in lending activities. There can be this liquidity trap. Oh, this is an interesting one for both deflation and liquidity trap. Here in the United States for the last, I'm just going to pick a time period, let's say 20 years, interest rates have been really low. Now, at some points in that time period, they've hit close to zero, not really zero, but when interest rates are 0%, it's tough to have a growing economy. And then in the bond market, we get lots and lots of implications, because if the Fed is buying all of these treasury bonds, then that means that others are not buying these treasury bonds. And so there's an influence on the demand for long-term bonds, which swings back. This is not part of this LOS, but it swings back to fiscal policy. Remember, the Treasury Department is issuing the bonds. And if the Fed can influence the yield on those treasury bonds, well, that's a limitation. How about fiscal policy? So remember, this is Congress, and so here in the United States, every 2 years we have an election for the House and for the Senate. But the policy objectives are fairly identical to monetary policy. What does it sound like? Promote stable economic growth, manage inflation, encourage investment activity. Yeah, all this stuff it's all good stuff. But remember, the focus on fiscal policy is the taxing and the spending. And so we're relying on our lawmakers to come up with an innovative tax policy that's going to, are you ready for this? Maximize the tax revenues that are generated by the federal government while not impeding economic growth, while not discouraging investment, while not discouraging employers from hiring. Now, this leads right into the advantages and disadvantages of fiscal policy. So remember what I said. Federal government does two things. They spend and they tax. So they have revenue tools and they have spending tools. And so they can they can spend over the long term. They can spend in the short term, but re-spend. So these are recurring. And then transfer payments, which are the social programs. Revenue tools, of course, are all the taxation policies. And these can be direct or indirect taxes. And I'm always fascinated by tax policies of federal governments out as it relates to state governments and as it relates to local governments. Read an article in the Wall Street Journal the other day about here, now that we're entering, the middle part of the later part of the fall season, that gasoline prices are going to expected to drop. because oil prices are dropping and because of other things that are going on with the administration. And the fascinating article said, okay, if the price of gas falls by a certain amount, let's say 10%, that some states are not going to realize it at all because they have higher tax on gasoline. How about arguments about whether the size of the national debt relative to GDP matters? Oh, this is a great question. This is a great question. I don't even know if there's a good answer to it, but think about this: the size of the national debt. So if you added all of the Treasury bills, all of the Treasury notes, all of the Treasury bonds outstanding as of late 2018, you're going to get a big number. A number that when I say it, it's really hard to wrap your head around, let alone your arms or your fingers. We're pushing $21 trillion here in the United States of national debt. And so it sounds to me that the size of the national debt matters. But what matters more is about its size relative to the size of the economy, to GDP, which is right about $20 trillion here in 2018 as well. So here are a couple things to consider. Large debt balance can cause instability. There's no doubt about it. You remember a few years ago, those of you who are paying attention in the United States, there was some talk that our Treasury bonds were going to lose their investment grade, their AAA rating. I'm not really sure what that means, but there was a lot of talk about investors losing confidence. And so in response to that, governments must either reduce spending, right? I don't know. And they got to cover these interest payments. And so there's another reason why interest rates have been low over the last 20 years, so that interest expense for the federal government is not too high. Yeah, here's a big concern. Increased currency printing. I mean, this is going to cause inflation. There's no doubt about it. How about difficulties of implementing fiscal policy? Yeah, this is a good question here. Think about what's happening when Congress passes a law and then it goes to the president to sign it. That happens sometime in the immediate future. It might, if it's a tax law, it might not go into effect until the following year. So there's a time lag between the actual implementation of the law and the actual economic consequences. Boy, there can be inaccurate information. I mean, think about all of the millions, I don't know, billions, I don't even know, trillions of bits of data that go into fiscal and monetary policy. There's bound to be inaccuracy. And then, of course, there's this crowding out. So when the government spends money, what it's doing, and when it invests, it's crowding out other investors and other spenders. And this is a side effect. All right, fiscal policy, is it expansionary or contractionary? This is a similar LOS to monetary policy. So expansionary policy means deficit spending and tax cuts and some subsidies. And then contractionary is just the opposite. Now, I've been hinting at this throughout the slide deck. What about the interaction between monetary and fiscal policy? Even though, think about it. You have the Congress over here, and then you have the central bankers over here. And there's the possibility that these two organizations don't talk to each other. And so one might have one plan, the other one might have a different plan, so they might cancel each other out. Or they might compound each other. And so it makes sense. It makes sense for the Congress and the central bank to at least visit with each other every once in a while. But then that brings in the specter that the Fed is not independent. It's not politically influenced. So you have the politicians in Congress who are going to visit with the central bankers. Well, that smacks of political influence. And that takes us through monetary and fiscal policy. Next up, we'll talk about imports and exports.